welcome back everybody to this fourth session on our learning path. In the last session, you had a chance to reflect on the videos that you recorded and watched and got yourself some feedback, not only from me, and not only from Rohit, but from each other. So in just a couple of minutes, we're going to reflect back on it. But first, I just want to ask you to think about what we learned in the last session. And so first of all, I'd like to have a volunteer to summarize the main learning points from the last session. So raise your hand if you could give us a 2-minute or less summary of the main points. Who's willing to give us a 2-minute summary? Praveen, thank you. Go ahead and turn on your mic.
Hi, Karen.
Hi.
I actually volunteered for the summary because I have a follow-up question. So I just wanted to, and that goes with the summary, so I'll just come to that. So
Okay.
What we discussed in the last session was mostly about the questions to ask, the way to debrief, and how TPMA evaluates ease. And then we talked about the types of questions. We talked about closed and open-ended questions. We talked about overhead and direct questions, and of course the pros and cons of each. And then we also spoke a little bit about repeat and then reverse, etc. So various kinds of questioning. And then we of course talked about having to read 5 questioning techniques, which are very important. We also talked about debriefing, which should be again to enable self-discovery and should not be asking very generalized kind of questions. So debrief model would be something like what happened, so what, which means what can be what we learned from that, and finally now what. So it is what, so what, and now what. And then we talked about lecture versus, so in teaching we have to avoid lecture because that of course has so many minuses that we spoke about. And so what should we do to avoid lecturing? Then finally we spoke about gender balance, and then of course there was the feedback between the group itself of our lost video. So that was kind of the session that we had last time. And my kind of question is that, I think gloss, we were very clear as to GLOSS, each of them stands for what. In ease, we have discussed so much in the previous session, and this last session that I just summarized. So I'm a little confused about what fits in, because this is also the most important part of like gloss, ease, and then feed and off. So if it is not time permitting now to summarize as to what fits where, because we have spoken about questioning, we have talked about debriefing, we have talked about gender, so many things we have spoken about. And in the previous session, we had spoken about what exactly ease is, to explain the topic, summarize, etc. So I'm a little confused here. Or if it's not fruitful for everyone to go through it, then maybe you can just guide me to some summary which I can find somewhere.
Oh, we can certainly take a moment. That's an important question. I want to make sure that everybody is aware of what's going on and understands it. So ease basically stands for, I think it's explain, I forgot the E, activities, and you summarize, and you do examples, you use examples and analogies. So the explain we kind of understand intuitively, that's when you give the content. But the idea is that throughout this, use activities as much as you can. And you can use activities in different ways and for different purposes. And that's what I think we talked about on the previous one. We spent most of what we spent in the last session and the prior session really relates to using activities, right? Whether it's thinking about the different purposes of activities, that you can use activities to help you explain so that you don't have to lecture as much. So if you know that your participants kind of know some of the content, but maybe they just haven't formalized their thinking about it, you can do activities where they tell you the information and you're just helping them to kind of put it into buckets that make sense for the theory that you're trying to explain, but you're pulling the knowledge out of it. And you could use activities to help them build skills. And those are, the type of practice activities. You can use activities to check their understanding. So as you go through a process, you do an activity to build skills, and then maybe you do another activity that uses some of what they learned before and some of what they learn now. And then the next time when you add the third step, you do an activity that uses step 1, step 2, and step 3. And that way you can see what progress is along the way. And you can use activities to measure whether or not they achieve the learning objective. So if the learning objective is list the components of a gloss, you can do an activity where you ask people, what does gloss stand for, right? Or you could say, as we did, record yourself doing an introduction using gloss. And then we can see by your videos, did you really understand how to use this? So that's what we mean by using it for measuring achievement, monitoring understanding. So you can use activities in so many different ways. So, and really anytime you do like a practice activity or even a thinking activity, the real learning comes not so much in the actual doing as it does in the reflecting back and going, oh, wait a minute, what did we see? What did we learn from this? And that's why that debrief is so important to do. And that's why we spent time yesterday telling you about this. What, so what, now what? That you start with, what did you do? What did you experience? So what lessons can you draw from that? Because now you're really starting to make something of this. And then now we want to get them to start applying that. So we go, well, now that you know these lessons, what are you going to do differently the next time that you do this? And so that's where the learning happens. So we spent a lot of time talking about activities. We didn't spend so much time talking about using examples or analogies. But the point is, if you work those into your explanation, it tends to make it easier for people. Keep in mind that the more you know about a subject, the easier it is for you to think in abstract concepts. And the less you know about a topic, the more concrete you need it to be, the more tangible and concrete. So anytime you can take an abstract concept and make it so that people can visualize it in their heads or in their eyes or in their hands, the more concrete you can make it, the more they're going to understand it. And then summarizing is just, at the end of the discussion, recap those main points so that people remember what it is that you're taking away. Do that before you go on to the next, because remember that people remember more the more they hear it. That's why marketing people and salespeople, they don't advertise once on TV, right? If you watch a TV show or a channel, they're advertising again and again and again, because the more you hear it, the more you remember it. So you can do the same thing by telling them what you're going to tell them the content, and then tell them what you told them, right? Remind them of those main points, and then move on to the next one. So does that help put it in a little bit of perspective for you, Praveen?
Thanks, Karen. It does.
Great, thank you. Great question. Are there any other questions that you would like to ask before we move on? Anything about the last module? Okay, well, let's go back then to thinking about what you did yesterday. And in particular, I'd like you to think about those feedback sessions that you had with your group mates towards the end of yesterday. And I'm going to break you up in just a couple of minutes into those same groups that you were in yesterday. And in your groups, I'd like you to just discuss these questions amongst yourself, thinking about the feedback you received from each other in your group. How helpful was that feedback? And more importantly, what made the helpful feedback helpful? What specifically made it helpful? And what did you find less helpful about the feedback you received? And then finally, think about it in terms of how did it feel to give feedback? So put the shoe on the other foot. Instead of how did it feel to receive, how did it feel to give the feedback? So you don't need to ascribe anything here, but a good idea to pick a spokesperson for the debrief, okay? So we'll give you just about 5 minutes to discuss this with each other. So Rohit, you want to tell us who's in the groups? Rohit? I think you're on mute.
Sorry. Yeah, the groups are the same as for the gloss practice. Group 1 is Louis, Praveen, and Shanaz. Group 2 are Asad, Hong, and Premasri. Group 3 are Akshi, Stephen, and Abdullah. I think Abdullah has not yet joined. Room 4 is Ezra, Fiona, and Shilpa. Room 5 is Ahmed, Chang, and Sheetal has also not yet joined. Room 6 is Mohsin and Vikram. And room 7 are Nicola, Kazi, and Shoma. But yeah, so you'll be moved to your rooms automatically. So even if you don't remember, you'll land up there.
Okay. All righty, thanks. So 5 minutes to discuss these questions about how did it feel to receive, what made it helpful, what made it not helpful, and how did it feel to give. Okay, go ahead, Rohit. Okay, I think we're all back, right? Yeah, looks like we're all here. So welcome back. I hope that was an interesting discussion to get things started. So the spokesperson for group one, how helpful did your group find the feedback today, the feedback sessions today?
Can you hear me, Karen?
Yes.
Hi, this is Praveen. So our group felt that it was useful. We said some good things to start with, some positive feedback. So that was quite helpful, and even the other feedback actually tied in with what feedback the experts gave. So it was useful to some extent.
And okay, great, thank you. And group 7, let's go down to the other side of the spectrum here. From the feedback that you thought was helpful, what specifically made it helpful? Somebody from group 7?
Yeah, okay. This is Shoma from group 7. I think we are group 7, aren't we, Karen?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, I think so.
So, yeah, in my group, we are Kazi, myself, and Nicola. Yes. So what we found that the feedback session was really very, very helpful for all of us. And it was helpful because when we did that, when we recorded our sessions, we thought that we all are perfect. You see, because we did it kind of with all the perfection, we did it quite a few times and thought that everything is perfect, so everything is included. But when we got the feedback from you and Rohit, so kind of the feedback was really, I would say, well structured. So we were not pushed back, neither kind of, I mean, like we got the appreciation for what we did right, as well as we got the kind of your observation on our own limitations, which we did not observe during the time we did the recording, even not after the time. I mean, we actually we three of us discussed the same, that we got our we looked into our videos quite a few times, but we could not identify those at that time. So this feedback from you, from Rohit, from Kazi, I meant for myself, from Kazi, from Nicola, and for all of us, having the feedback from the group as well as from others, were very, very helpful. I would say that here we understood what, I mean, it was from the other perspective, like we observed the others, we observed, the other group members' videos, where we saw what they are doing good. That was a learning point for all of us. And we, our group members, we also shared the, feedback that you provided. So there we understood what were good. So we wanted to kind of capitalize on those strengths, and what were our limitations. So it could be my limitation or Kazi's or Nicola's, but we thought that, okay, these are the limitations that we could make, and we made these mistakes, but we could not understand. So that was basically why I would say that it was very, very helpful for all of us. And
thank you.
Maybe, yeah.
If I may add, from the same group, what was not helpful, I remember I was trying to convince my other peer members about what we did not do well, but I couldn't give very clear examples. So that was probably not helpful to them. They are very polite. They're not telling me that. Then I show the example, Karan and Rohit, the feedback that you gave me about, I didn't talk about the purpose, the objective in the correct way. And those objectives should be in a smart format. I think initially there was a challenge. But Nicola had an interesting point. Nicola basically told me, yeah, your one was more or less good. So that later Nicola told me that, yeah, because he didn't even realize that I was not right. So that feedback was not very helpful. So I tried to answer the other question, how it was not helpful as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Kazi, and thank you, Shoma. So there's a lot of good points coming out of that some of the things that made it helpful was that it was structured and it was balanced. It wasn't just all negative or all positive. It was most helpful when it was a mix of both. And it was less helpful when it was vague or when no clear specific examples that you could point to. Absolutely. So group 3, Do you have anything else that you'd like to add about what made it helpful or less helpful, the feedback you received from each other? Anybody in group 3?
Which is group 3? Fiona, is that ours? Ezra?
Group 3 was Akshi and Stephen.
Ah, okay.
Hi, sorry, I can't remember which group I'm in every time. Lack of memory. So I think that the thing that we discussed is providing feedback can sometimes also be daunting, right? It was helpful, and how do you make sure that it's helpful? And I think what we discussed is also positive attitude. I think and I'll speak for myself, being Dutch, we're quite direct. So we'll tell you when we like something and when we don't. But as long as people can see you smile, they know that there's positive intent behind it. And I think that in itself makes feedback helpful, because the moment you feel that you get either standardized feedback or, let's say, feedback with a negative intent, you will tend to look away, which is one of the reasons why I'm always we should see you minded. I want to see how you say it, not just hear you say it. So I think that's what we discussed. Try and smile, because that will make the feedback come across positive.
Great, thank you, Stephen. Kasi, did you want to say something there? Oh, okay, he just had it on. Yeah, and I think that's a really good point that I don't know why my camera keeps going dark on me here. But it's a really good point. Sorry, apologies about why my camera is going all funky on me here. But it's a really good point that you're bringing up, which is that a lot of this has to do with how you say it and what's your intent. If your intent is to be critical of someone, they're going to feel that, and then they're going to get more defensive. But if you come at it from a place of goodness, that, I'm giving this to you as a gift, something to help you, then people tend to be a little bit more receptive to it. So I think that's a really good point. So let me go over to group 5, who I don't think we've heard from yet. And let me ask you, how did it feel to give feedback, not to receive it? How did it feel to give feedback in the group?
Hello, Karen. Ahmed is here from group 5.
Who is this? Oh, Ahmed. Okay.
Ahmed is here from group 5. Yeah. Really, it feels great when you're giving feedback to someone and you're judging someone. And really, you make us trainer at that time, and we feel that we are master trainer, and seeing each and every act of the other person in the video and try to memorize each thing and try to evaluate the video with the help of gloss which you provide us. Really, it feels great. But actually, what I would like to say, the way you people did the feedback to our videos are great. You actually did the postmortem of our videos from A to Z. You're very clear about your feedback is very clear, I must say. But actually, our feedback is not like yours, because we are in a beginning stage and in a learning stage. But it feels great when we are judging someone.
Well, wow, you must be in the minority, because most people will tell us, it's a little bit not so comfortable.
You can't judge people.
Sorry, Mohsin Saab.
Mohsin, go ahead. You want to say something? Want to add to that?
Okay. Sorry?
Or you want to add a comment?
Yeah, I would like you definitely, because this is a must-have skill, not nice to have a skill, basically, for the trainers. It's very, very important, because someone said feedback is like the breakfast of the champion. If you give wrong feedback, it's going to have the wrong output as well. Now, you got to be very careful. There's a formula for this one, and that is the sandwich approach. The sandwich approach is soft, then the hard part, which is the negative, and then the soft part. Now, where do we err? What doesn't make it helpful? When we are personality centric, you got to be behavioral centric. You can you can attack the behavior, but you cannot attack the personality. You cannot judge people. You cannot say you did wrong. You can say, okay, you were lacking. You can point out the behavior basically. So if you do like that one, then it's very, very useful. And I would say, without feedback, you cannot outgrow yourself basically.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I like Shanaz had a comment too, that giving feedback made me feel a huge sense of responsibility. And she said she watched her colleagues' videos at least 3 times. And that's wonderful that you did that. It is a huge responsibility because you're right. You don't want to give the wrong impression. And as we've seen from this activity and from our own experiences, some feedback is more valuable than other feedback. And a lot of people find it harder to give feedback than it is to get feedback because they don't feel comfortable with that responsibility. They don't want to hurt anybody's feelings. They don't want to deal with all of the pushback, whatever the reason. For a lot of people, giving feedback is actually harder than getting it. But as Mohsin said, feedback is critical. It's that breakfast of champions that helps people learn and grow. And in order to do this, we have a formula that can help us to learn it, to give it better. And so we're going to cover that in this session today. We're going to talk today about the help me phase, which is all about giving feedback. And this is going to help in particular those pragmatists. So Stephen, this is the section on how the pragmatists get their help. And then we're also going to talk about the activists, what they need. And we're going to talk about the prepare me phase and how you conclude and prepare people to use what they've learned in the classroom. So that's what we're going to cover in this session today. So one of the things that we mentioned in the last session was that participants learn more from activities when the trainer asks insightful debrief questions. But when it comes to building skills, feedback is the other main way that participants learn. And up until this point in the learning cycle, the trainer has provided information by introducing the content, has presented it, and maybe the participants have done a few activities. But it's during the help me phase that they really practice and, more importantly, get that feedback. Now, you may remember that in the online learning that you had to do before you came here, God bless you, whoever that was, that we talked about a thing called Ask CC. And we said that in order for training to stick, it has to address the attitude, the skills, the knowledge, the confidence, and the commitment. And so here in the feedback, this is where you're starting to build their confidence. If they know that they can do the skill the right way, they are more likely to continue using it once they leave the class. And in order to make sure that they're doing it right and to build that confidence, they need that feedback. Even in a live online learning, just like this, that practice is critical to skills development. So if you're training people and you're not giving them a chance to practice, you're probably not doing a live online learning session. You're probably just having them attend a webinar and you're just sharing information. But this lesson, we're going to look at how to give feedback on practice activities. So by the time you're done, you'll be able to explain why constructive feedback is critical to the learning process. You'll be able to describe the components of the feed formula, and you'll be able to describe what else you need to pay attention to when you're giving feedback. And we'll do that using the TPMA criteria. Now, one important point to keep in mind is that the most useful feedback as many of you pointed out, is specific. It's relevant, it's constructive, and it's enlightening. And a formula can make it easier to give meaningful feedback. So how do you think, before we move on, how do you think this lesson on feedback is going to help you personally? Go ahead and write your answer in the chat. How do you think this lesson on giving feedback is going to help you personally? You can enter your answer in the chat. It's going to help you to enable and motivate your trainees. Yeah, I like that. And it's going to make you more purposeful in giving your feedback, right? And make you more competent. Right, it's got, Nicola says, teach proper techniques, because sometimes it's difficult to give feedback because you don't want to feel offensive. And yeah, and all of those. And frankly, what you're going to learn here is not only going to help you when you're training participants, but it's also going to help you when you're giving feedback in any situation, whether it's at work with your colleagues or with your family. This formula is really good, and it is going to help you in so many different ways. And it's going to help you assess your own training session. So the FEED formula, FEED is an acronym, and the first F starts by meaning frame your positive intent. And this really has two aspects to it. The first aspect is kind of like what Stephen was saying earlier, that when you begin to give feedback, or at least at the start of the first piece of feedback, if you have multiple points to make, frame the discussion by conveying that you have the best interests of the person in mind, that you're doing this out of a place of goodness and not out of a place of meanness or anything. So I'm going to give you an example throughout this whole explanation, and imagine for this continued example that I'm giving feedback to somebody in a training of trainers course. So I might start out by saying something like, well, I want to give you some feedback to make you an even better trainer, right? What I'm doing here, this is a gift. This is not me being mean. It's not me being critical. It's that. But then the second aspect is to start by identifying a positive, concrete aspect. And be as specific as possible. Try to avoid generalizations or broad statements. And a lot of us, especially if we do a lot of editing work or review work, we're kind of in the mindset of let's find all the faults. And we kind of tend to go there automatically. But if you make a point of starting your feedback with the words, I liked, it reminds you to say something positive and frame that positive intent. So in that course on training of trainers, I might say to somebody, I liked that you provided a strong link between the activity and the introduction. So that's a lot more specific than just saying, hey, great transitions. You know, now you know which is the good, what's an example of a good transition, and what should I keep doing more of? Then after you frame your positive intent, you examine the evidence. And here you describe specifically what you have observed. So if you are just giving positive feedback, which sometimes is all that you have to say, still try to get as specific as possible so that they know what to continue doing. And if you want to give suggestions for improvement, it's especially important to provide concrete examples for behaviors that you would like to improve. So you can use this examine evidence section as the start of the discussion on that thing that you really want to fix. When you do this, a good way to begin this is to use the phrase, I noticed. And then, as I believe Mohsin said, focus on the action or the behavior, not on the motivation or the personality. And as you speak, avoid absolute statements. and evaluative comments. So for instance, it's better to say, I also noticed that you tended to call on a few participants more than others. See, that's a better way to put it than to say, you know, you must have had some favorite participants because you called on them all the time. So let's examine that the first sentence for a few moments, because there's a couple of things I want to point out. Notice that we started with I noticed. We do that intentionally because statements beginning with I are a lot easier for the recipient to take in than statements that begin with you. So if I say, I noticed you did this, that's easier to receive than saying, you did this, right? As soon as it becomes you did this, the recipient gets all defensive. So that's why we say start with I. Also notice that I said you tended to call on a few participants more than others. I didn't say you called on 2 participants or you only called on 2 participants. Why? Because there's an interesting quirk of human nature at play here. Generally, people are a little bit reluctant to accept feedback. And so what they will do is if they feel like if they can find that there's something wrong in your statement or something false, then they can just disregard the entire comment. So if I were to say, okay, I noticed that you always called on Akshi and Louis. And then the recipient says, well, no, I specifically remembered one time I let Mohsin answer. Then they're going to think, well, she doesn't know what she's talking about. And they dismiss the entire feedback, missing the big point that you need to call on more people. So don't give them that out. If you're a little bit vague about you tended to do this using softer words, you called on a few participants, it's a little bit harder for them to dismiss it. And also notice that in the second version, the not good version, I said, you must have had some favorite participants because you called on them, right? So that's what I mean by don't comment on the motivation. That's the motivation. I'm assuming that the reason you kept calling on those same 2 people was because they were your favorites. Well, the problem is that I can't know what's in your head, right? Only you know what's in your head. So if I guess wrong, then you're going to say, well, that's false, negate the whole thing and dismiss the feedback, right? So don't try to guess what's in somebody else's head. Just talk about what you observed. Also, do not comment on personal traits or behaviors that the person cannot control. So if somebody has a stutter, don't tell them that they are stuttering. They know that, believe me, they're very aware, so it's not really helpful. After you examine the evidence, then you explain the effect. And here you describe your own reaction to the behavior or the action, or how others might perceive it. And this is really valuable because a lot of the time we don't realize the words that we use, what their impact is on other people, or our behaviors, what their impact is on others. So giving people the chance to see it from a different viewpoint can help them accept the content and accept the feedback a little bit better. Now, when you are explaining the effect, state only 1 or 2 of the most significant consequences. You don't have to give a whole laundry list. So for example, I could continue with that same example about I noticed that you tended to call on a few participants more than others. And I could add to that using the phrase, it had the effect, or this had the effect, or this made us, right? So I could say, when you call on the same people for answers, it makes the rest of us feel like you do not care about us, right? See, now you're explaining why this is an issue, as opposed to just criticizing them and saying, you never call on the rest of us. And finally, the last step is describe recommendations. And for those of you who learned feed on the Business Edge TOT course many years ago, we've changed what the D stands for. It's the same thing, but the words are a little bit different. It's now described the recommendations. And here, this is where you suggest an alternative or a solution. So when you do this, give options to show that your intent is constructive and genuine rather than critical. And by giving options, you allow the recipient to be in control of what's happened and make the choice of which way to go. You're not directing. And it's always a good idea to avoid directive advice. So try to avoid phrases like, well, you should do this, or the real problem is blah, 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 right? Because that sounds kind of condescending. And my favorite one is, you know, if I were you, I would blah, blah, blah. Right? Well, you're not me, so don't tell me what I am. So instead, try phrases like, I suggest, I would recommend, may I suggest, you might want to try, in the future, consider. Anything along those lines helps the recipient to be able to accept or reject the advice. So I might say in my example, I suggest that in the future, you try to alternate choosing participants from different parts of the room. Or if you're doing this online, you could say from different parts of the list. So that's how the FEED formula works. In the handout you received yesterday, there was a sheet called Examples of Feedback Using FEED. And that gives you some other examples of FEED in action. And as some of you rightly said, in the feedback you received from us on your videos, you can go back and look at that because those are all in FEED too. But let's now go and see this in action with a quick activity here. So in just a moment, I'm going to show you another feedback example using FEED. And I'd like you to use the annotation function to mark where in the feedback is the F, where is the E, where is the other E, and where is the D. And so to do this, remember that the annotation tool, you have to go up to the top next to where it says you're viewing my screen, click on View Options, and click Annotate. Now, when you do this, you can either use the drawing one and just underline or circle or bracket the phrases, or you can use the text one and mark it with an F and an E and an E and a D, but do so using the colors. So mark the F in red, mark the examine the evidence in blue, explain the effect in pink, and discuss the solution, describe the recommendations in green. Okay, so in case you forget what colors are what, we've listed it on the next slide too. So here's the first one, and this is from a course on managing financial records. And you can mark it up as I read it out loud, or you can wait until it's done. So it says, I like the way you have clearly entered expenses with the purchase date. I noticed that you mixed business expenses and personal expenses on the same ledger. This had the effect of making it difficult to see at a glance how much money you are spending on your business versus your family. That in turn makes it harder to calculate your business's profits. I suggest you keep separate records for business and personal expenses. That's great. I see some of you have started this already. I'll give you a few minutes to mark it up. Yeah. Yep, you got them all correct. Yep. It's nice too, because once you know what those key phrases are, it makes it really easy to find everything. Yeah, you got it all correct. Good job. All right, Rohit, can you clear that screen, please? And let's try this one more time. So this is from a Training of Trainers course. We'll do this again. You demonstrate a clear understanding of how to use gloss. You did an excellent job of getting attention by asking a provocative question at the outset. I noticed there was some confusion between the objectives and the structure. As a participant, I was not sure what you, as the presenter, expected of me. Did you want me to describe the theory in detail or be able to give examples of it? I suggest you use the phrase, by the end of this session, you will be able to, ... This provides a clear signal of your expectation. Yeah, this one's a little bit trickier, right? Because it's not quite using all of the phrases, and that's okay too, so long as you hit all the 4 components. But I think it's an easier way to do it if you start with using those phrases, because it reminds you. And then as you get more comfortable giving feedback, then you can kind of forget to use the I liked because you use some other words. And actually, I believe in your handouts, there's one that gives you some other phrases that you can use too. But the good news is that all of you managed to figure out, it looks like, for the most part, what was what. I see some orange, which I believe is meant to be the red for frame. And remember that I see one that I'm not quite sure if that orange is on the getting attention or on the I noticed. But I'm going to assume it's on the getting attention, and that's the F, right? Good. So I think you've got I like that. Somebody's using the hearts. Cool. That's fun. That works. Great. Well, a couple of things to keep in mind. Giving feedback in training is a little bit different than giving feedback in the workplace. Generally, in the workplace context, it's a good idea to ask questions to identify the cause of the problem before offering a suggestion. And the goal of those questions is root cause analysis. In the training context, it's also a good idea to first ask the participants to comment on their own performance before soliciting feedback from others or providing your own feedback. And here the goal is a little bit different. It's really to allow for self-discovery and to increase self-awareness. Another difference in the workplace is that it's a good practice to ask the person receiving the feedback to provide their own alternatives so that the person is more committed to doing it the new way in the future. And while these are good ideas to do in a one-on-one meeting, it's not often feasible to do that in a training setting due to time constraints. However, asking the class for alternative suggestions can be a nice way to involve the group and get more ideas if time permits. Well, using the feed format is one way that we judge the quality of feedback given during class. The TPMA distinction criteria and evidence indicators are another. And Rohit, can you clear the screen, please? Thank you. So in your handouts, you received a handout for the TPMA feed evidence indicators. And you can either go ahead and pull that up so you have it in front of you, or you can see them here. Luckily, there's not a whole lot. But what I'd like you to do in the next 2 minutes or so is rate yourself from 1 to 5 on each of the criteria, on each of the indicators. Rate yourself a 1 if you never do this, and rate yourself a 5 if you happen to do this exceptionally well. So go ahead and do that. And then when you're done, you can use your annotation function to write your scores, write your rankings up on the screen here. So this, you're probably better off just using the text button annotation feature and just write where you had 1s, 2s, 3s, 4s, and 5s. There's room to the left. You can write, there's some room to the right. You can write it anywhere you can fit it in. So I'll give you about 2 or 3 minutes to do that. And Hong, I see your question, and I will answer it just after we finish this discussion real quick, just because I want people to be able to focus on their thinking, their self-assessment. So just give them a few minutes. Okay, thank you. So most of you feel pretty good about this. I do see a couple of 2s over by offer appropriate support and coaching as needed, and a 2 over by deal swiftly, and a question. So let's start with the question of deal swiftly and appropriately with the participants' need for too much support so as not to disadvantage the rest of the group. So what does this mean? That means, this means every once in a while, you get a participant in your class who's just constantly like, oh, can you help me? Well, what about my issue? And, you know, I need you and I need you. And they're always pulling your attention. They're always asking you questions. They always have to have you come over and help them because I don't get this or whatever. And so the trick here is really about, you have to give them what they need, but don't do it to the extent that nobody else is getting attention. You have to be able to find a way to balance that. And that can sometimes be a really tricky thing to do. So I'm curious, for whoever wrote a 2 by the first one, offer appropriate support and coaching as needed. You want to comment on why, you know, what were your thoughts, why you gave yourself a 2 for that? Feel free to open your mic.
Kazi here.
No, go ahead, Kazi. Thank you.
I think what I learned yesterday when Rohit said reverse questions. Some people might even ask obvious questions, and I have a feeling that they already know it or they can find out themselves. This is one way. I might ask him, tell me, where else did you do before? Depends on the context. So support doesn't always mean that I will do it for him or her. Rather, I would encourage him to do the work and get it done. So it's inside out, it would be my approach. Is this what is appropriate? Or
yeah, I think that's a reasonable approach in the sense of, you know, like you said, sometimes it depends on the situation and the work, but it's not always giving the answer to somebody. support doesn't necessarily mean giving them. It means asking them the questions so that they can figure it out for themselves. And a lot of times, especially if we're in a hurry, we tend to just say, well, do it this way, right? And that's what we're trying to get out. I want to come back. Thank you for sharing that, Kazi. I want to come to Hong's question about, do we need to do feed in this exact order? And this, unlike gloss and ease, this one you actually do need to do in this order because it helps set the mood for what people want. So I would say, yes, this one you do need to do it in that order. Okay, well, okay, this is as good a time as any then let's take a break because we just hit the 1 hour mark. We'll take 5 minutes and then we'll come back and we'll look at some more feedback and see what lessons we can draw from this feedback. So we'll be back in 5 minutes. I've got the top of the hour, so 5 after. See you in 5. Okay, I've got 5 after.
Yep, we're back.
So I see there are a number of questions coming in. These are excellent questions. We're going to have keep them coming. We'll get to a question part in just a little bit, but there's a little bit more I'd like to tell you before I answer the questions about feedback. So let's go through a little bit more. And when we get to the question part, I'll answer them, but I appreciate you writing them, and we will try to answer them. So we talked about the feed formula. We talked about how important it is and how it can help and how you do want to use it in the order it's given. And we talked about there's other aspects to giving feedback too. So let's talk about feedback some more. And I'm going to show you in just a few moments some examples of feedback that we're giving from a course in customer service. And I'd like you to write in the chat box what you think about the feedback. And in particular, you know, what could be better about the feedback. So here's the first one. Oops, here's the first one. Nice job. If I were going to correct anything, it would be that you did not actually offer them a solution to their problem. You were very sweet and kept them calm, and that was good. So first question is, did this follow the feed format? Yes or no? Go ahead and write your answer in the chat. Shilpa says no. So does Shana. Yeah, absolutely. So that's the first problem with this. Definitely, everybody agrees that was not following the format. And Hong says it wasn't even sincere. Thank you. Yeah, I think so. What else kind of bothered you about this feedback? What else is wrong? And here you don't need, it's not specific. Right. It's very vague. Yeah, the whole thing about being sweet, you know, that's a personality issue. It's not a behavior, and your feedback should focus on the behavior. Absolutely. Anything else? So the other thing too is it buries the constructive criticism too deeply within the positive feedback. And this is actually my issue with the sandwich formula that that Mohsin mentioned earlier, is that the problem, to me, there's 2 problems with the sandwich format. One is exactly this, that it buries the constructive feedback too deeply within the positive feedback. And this has the effect that the listener might miss the issue altogether. And the second thing is that so many people know this approach that they now totally disregard the opening statement because they know this is just, yeah, just get me to what I gotta fix. So it's not as effective as it used to be. And there is a conflict between this very vague praise and then this very specific criticism. So would somebody like to volunteer, raise your hand, to turn this into a feed formatted feedback? And you can make whatever assumptions you want for, in terms of specifics. But who could kind of take this and turn this into something in a feed? Go ahead and raise your hand if you're willing to do this. And when you do it, you can open your mic. You don't have to type it all out. Nobody's volunteering to make this into.
Let me.
Thank you, Esther.
I like the way you were very sweet and kept them calm. That was good. I noticed that you did not actually offer them a solution to their problem. So that's
okay. And so you got the I liked and the I noticed. So go ahead and put something in for the effect. And you can make up stuff. It doesn't have to be these exact.
I noticed that you did not offer them a solution to their problem. yeah, that should be a recommendation or.
First you need to say, what's the effect, right? So then the third part is, this had the effect of.
Yes.
And Shanaz is helping out here. She says, it had the effect that some participants seemed confused or lost. Exactly. Thank you, Shanaz. And so then what's the final step, Ezra?
Just.
Hello?
Final step is, final step should be giving them the necessary recommendation, suggestion.
Right. So what would
options.
you say? What would, go ahead and put in some words here.
I would suggest if you do, if you give them the options that they can use, type of, suggestions.
Right, exactly. I would suggest next time you offer them a couple of options that they can choose from. Exactly. Yeah, good. Yeah, that helps to make it a little bit more concrete, a little bit more within their control. It gives them some direction. The one thing I would suggest, as I hear the feedback that you just gave, is I noticed that you said, I like that you were sweet and then you offered, and then you kept them calm. So that you put in that part about the sweet, which is actually talking about their personality. And generally when you give feedback, that would be the thing you want to not do. So the keeping them calm is what I would suggest you just keep your I noticed or I liked to. So just take out the sweet altogether.
Yes, I missed that. You're right.
And yeah, I don't. Right. And Shilpa's saying, I would suggest if you could make them think through some options. And she also suggested, I like that you dealt with it calmly. Exactly. Great. Well, here's one more. Let's try this one. So I like that you quickly found a suitable resolution to the customer's problem. But I noticed that you had your hands on your hips as you talked to the customer. This made you seem defensive. Don't do that in the future. So again, in the chat, what's your reaction to this feedback? What could make this even better? Ah, very good, Mohsin. Mohsin says, but is a wrong word to use. Absolutely. That's a really, really big point. That but is a super powerful word. And a lot of times we do just this. I like that you found the quick resolution, but I noticed, right? That but is so powerful because but erases everything that came before it. So as soon as people hear but, they say, okay, whatever they just said, they didn't even mean that. So when you're going from I like to I noticed, make sure not to say but or however. Just when you feel yourself going that way, just pause and take a breath. It's better off you go, I like that you found a suitable resolution to the customer's problem. I noticed that you had. Try to avoid that, but that's really big. Don't do that. Nicholas says, don't do that. It's too straightforward. It's too strong. Absolutely. It's too directive. Give them a choice. I suggest that you put your hands by your side or, keep your hands away is a little bit softer. And right. And Shanaz says, this made you seem defensive that it's a judgment. Don't do that. And don't is another word to avoid. Exactly. Try to put it in the positive. Such as, I suggest you maintain an open hand posture. Very good. Hong asked the question, why can't we praise a personal trait? Because generally speaking, you can't change your personality all that much. What you can change is your behavior. A sweet person's going to be sweet, and a person who's not sweet, it's hard for them to become sweet. They don't, it's just not who they are. So the best you can do is change their behaviors. And then eventually, if they change their behaviors enough, their personality will follow. So, but, to compliment them for just who they are, it's like complimenting them on something they can't control. And so that's why we say don't comment on the personality so much, because they're not really consciously doing it. What you want to do is focus on what they're consciously doing well so they continue, and then not well so they can improve. So in addition to avoiding these common mistakes, there are a few other tips to keep in mind about feedback. First of all, be honest and sensitive. Remember that participants are already uncomfortable doing the new activity or skill or task. So build their confidence and their comfort by not giving too much or too harsh feedback. Be sensitive to their emotional state. Collaborate. So alternate between providing all the feedback yourself and allowing participants to provide ideas. Participants, especially adults, often have other good ideas about how else to address or solve the issue. So don't feel like you need to be the only one with the answers. Leverage your participants' experiences and respect their ideas. Keep it short. This is 2 meetings. One, if you spot many things that can be improved, pick just a few of the most important ones to address. Don't go through a whole long list of corrections, or it's going to hurt their confidence. And also, when you're giving feedback on a particular issue, be concise. Say it, provide the evidence, give the suggestions, and then move on to the next point. Don't keep circling back and belaboring it. And finally, avoid mixed messages. Because many of us are uncomfortable giving feedback, we often finish with phrases like, well, otherwise, good job. Or aside from that, you did really well. And these phrases actually tend to diminish the constructive feedback that you offered because it minimizes them a little bit. So instead, just simply thank them for their efforts, and that's good enough. And then finally, watch your body language. Keep in mind that we say more with our facial expressions than we do with our mouths. So make sure your body language matches your mouth. So, and I'll turn on my camera for this one. If I say, I hope you can see me here. If I say, good job, right? Does that really, am I really saying that's a good job? Not really. It's clear I didn't mean that. So don't underestimate the power of the message conveyed without words. And to prove this to you, I want to do a little experiment with you. So in just a second, I'm going to show you some colored dots, and they're going to appear sequentially on the screen. I'm only going to show this to you one time. So pay attention. I want you to remember the order in which the colored dots appear. Okay, ready? Here we go. Okay, now in the chat, please write down the order that the colors appeared. I'm seeing yellow, green, brown, blue, red. Oh, Stephen's colorblind, sorry about that. Yellow, green, red, brown, blue. Yellow, green, red, brown, blue. Yellow, green, brown, blue, red. Yellow, green, brown, red. Aha. So we've got some differences here. What about you want color sequence? Yeah, we want the colors that they appeared on the sequence that they appeared on the screen. Some of you are picking it up. So the correct answer was actually yellow, green, brown, blue, red. Yellow, green, brown, blue, red. So for those of you who got it wrong, why did you get it wrong? And I heard some of you kind of were alluding to this. Yeah, the names of the color were different. Right, the names and the colors were different, absolutely. And we did that on purpose, because those of you who are visual learners, you probably looked at the actual colors, yellow, green, brown, blue, red, no problem, saw it. Those of you who are linguistic learners, you probably focus more on the words. And so you probably put yellow, green, red, brown, blue, or something to that effect. And that's exactly the point, that we process, and this comes back, Stephen, to what we were talking about, I think yesterday or the day before, we process information differently. We give different weighting to it in our head. We do that visual, like when we see here, but we also do it with when we talk and listen to people. So some people are going to listen more to what you say, but others are going to listen more to what your facial expressions convey. So again, I'm going to turn on the camera now. So if I say, oh, that was exciting, was that really exciting? Am I really conveying that? The answer is no. Well, we call this, when your body language does not match your spoken words, we call that incongruence. And it's really important to be aware of what your body and your face is doing so that your body language and your words are congruent with each other. So now that you have, and I'm going to turn that off. Now that you've learned about feed, I'm gonna give it, I want you to give it a try and coach each other, and then we'll have the question period, I promise you. But right now we're gonna break you up into groups again. And we're gonna give you about 10 minutes. And what I'd like you to do is think about the feedback you gave to each other on each other's gloss feedback, gloss videos. Pick one piece of feedback that you gave to somebody else in your group that was not already in a feed format, and restate that same piece of feedback, but this time use feed. So one of you will talk first, and you'll give your feedback to somebody else, and that person will listen. And then the third person in the group is the observer. And the observer, I'd like you to coach the feedback giver. Did they follow feed? Did they follow it? If not, help them to help coach them to give that feedback using feed. Okay. So, and then if you finish with one person, move on to the next person so that you can rotate around. All right. So we'll break you up into those same groups, and we'll give you about 10 minutes. Rohit, you want to take us out?
Yeah, I'll just do that. So Karen, this kept going back to 30 minutes for some reason. I couldn't change it to 10 minutes, so I'll manually switch it off after 10 minutes.
Yeah, that's weird. I was going to ask you what was happening.
Yeah, so I kept deleting the 3, and every time I would put 10, it would change back to 30. I don't know what is the issue with that.
Okay, well, just keep an eye on the clock.
Yeah, I'll do that.
Okay. Actually, we might scooch it down to 8 minutes and take them out a little bit earlier.
Should I send a message that the timer may be showing 28 minutes, but we're going to shut it down in 10 minutes or 8 minutes?
Yeah, or just tell them how much more. Tell them the timer isn't working right, and we'll keep you informed of how much time you have left. So what time are we going to bring this one back?
You want to bring it down to 8 minutes, Karen?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Okay, well, it looks like most of us are back. So let me ask, and this anybody can just comment via the microphone. How did what was the hardest part about giving feedback using the feed format? What was hardest for you?
The hardest point I experienced was remembering all the specifics. So I just go back to my notes and use my notes, because there has been, it has been 2 days, and I didn't, normally I won't remember all the commands. I have all the notes. So I looked at my notes.
Yeah, and that's a really great point, especially if you're giving feedback in a class and everybody is going, like doing their 5-minute presentation, you got one and then the next, it gets hard after a while to keep track of everything. And so one of the things I always do, I set up, just as a trainer trick, I set up a piece of paper and I write the pluses. I divide it in half, with pluses on one side and minuses on the other. And I just write notes to myself. And that way, when it comes time to give them the feedback, I look to, and I say, I like, and then I can pull something off the plus side. And then when I say I noticed, I can pull something off the minus side. And that way it's a little bit quicker to keep it going. So that's just a trick I use. And then I frame the rest of it properly, but at least so I remember. So Shanaz said she had trouble with the effect. Shanaz, you want to talk about that?
I didn't have my notes in front of me. I think that was part of the problem. So I was trying to recall, what it was that really kind of bothered me yesterday when Louis was, kind of getting into the content. So I think it was just difficult for me to express, what the effect was on me. I don't know, I couldn't put words to it.
Yeah,
right now.
Yeah, that gets tricky. Like sometimes, you just feel like as a gut, this is wrong, but it's hard to figure out why it's wrong. But it does help if you can give that. Yeah. Kazi said he had trouble giving the positive feedback first. And I see that a lot when we do these practices, that people just jump right into what's wrong. And I think it's always a good personal reminder too, to always look for what's positive too, not just what's wrong. Well, I want to come back now. Thank you for your feedback on that. I hope you found that helpful. And I want you to know that if it felt uncomfortable for you at first and awkward to use this, don't worry, because it's kind of like riding a bike. And the more you do it, the easier it becomes. And once you get used to it, it really is effective. I use this a lot. I don't use it all the time outside of training, but I use it a lot. And it really makes things a lot easier. It takes away so much of the anger. So I do really recommend it. I do want to come back to a couple of the questions before we close out this section. There were two that I saw. One is, okay, but when's the right time to give the feedback? And that's an excellent question. There's a saying about you want to catch people doing things right, catch them in the moment. So generally speaking, it's best to give it fairly close to when it happens so that the memory of the experience is fresh in their head. If you're in a training class, generally, I suggest you let people do the activity first. Let them struggle with it. You can coach them a little if you see they're way off base. Just, guide them a little bit back to the right path. And then afterwards, when you do the debrief and you ask them, how did that feel? What did you notice? What lessons can you learn? That's a good time to pull in some of those big feedbacks. Rohit, anything you want to add on that question?
I think it may also depend on, sorry, how you have structured your, the session as such. But yes, I agree that the sooner the better, because at least the memory is fresh, both with you in giving the feedback and with the person receiving as well.
Absolutely. Thank you. And then the other question I saw was, there's a question of how much time should you have the camera on and what's the ratio? And it really depends on what the point of the meeting is and what the point of the activity is. It is a best practice now to put on the camera at the beginning and then turn off your camera while you give the content slides, and then turn it on for either debriefs or for at least Q&A. And that way you still get some of that feedback, but you're not distracting the participants too much. And it doesn't, if you want to use the camera, it's not really a matter of time. It's really a matter of effect. A lot of people feel that actually having it on can be distracting, or that it doesn't really add anything. So if turning it on is going to add to the meaning you're providing, like I did when I was talking about congruence, then that's a good time to turn it on. If you're just going through 12 things you need to do, having you on screen isn't really going to add all that much value, frankly. But it's also a matter of personal taste. And what I'm talking about are the current best practices, but these are constantly changing too. So, and it depends. If you're doing a strategy session rather than a training session, yeah, you probably are going to want to keep the camera on, because then you are discussing things and you're trying to work with each other. So it depends on the purpose of the meeting. Any other questions on feedback before we move to the next topic?
If there are more than one feedback, let's say, and how do you do that? How do you say that?
Yeah, good. So great question. So if you've got 3 feedbacks to give, do you go 3 positives, 3 E's, 3 E's, and 3 D's? No, go feed, feed, feed. And go through one whole feed cycle for the first one, then add a second, then add a third.
Thanks.
Okay, good. All right, well, let's revisit the main points from this lesson. So we learned about the help me phase and why it's important. We learned that it's important because feedback is a gift and it helps people to grow. We learned about the 4 components of feed. And what were those 4 components of feed? Go ahead and write them in the chat. What does feed stand for? Go ahead and write them in the chat. Frame the positive intent, right? And what's the first D? Examine the evidence, right? And then what's the second E? Explain the effect, good. And then what's the last one? What's the D? Describe the recommendations. You got it. Yeah, right. Absolutely. You got it. And then we talked about the other criteria about giving feedback too. So now we're going to focus on what you need to do to conclude effectively. And I'd like you to imagine that you just finished a nice dinner at a friend's house. And imagine that at the end of the evening, you're leaving your home, or you're leaving their home, your friend's home, and you stand in the doorway, you turn to say goodbye, and you discover that your host has already shut the door. How would you feel? Go ahead and write your answer in the chat. So how would you feel? You turn to say goodbye, and they've already shut the door behind you. Annoyed, says Praveen. Unwelcome, says Shanaz. Insulted, says Shilva. Miserable, says Mohsin. Absolutely, yeah. All of this, irritated. Why didn't they say goodbye? And or why didn't we say goodbye before? Well, sometimes we like to say a couple of goodbyes. Ahmed thinks it's a corona precaution. Get out of my house as quickly as possible. Well, yeah, I mean, this is kind of like what happens at the end of your training course, minus the corona protection precaution. Your participants are like guests in your class. And if you just finish what you have to say and then say, well, that's all I got to say, so thank you, and then you dismiss everyone, it leaves your participants feeling a little like our friend in this image here. So this lesson looks at how to conclude with style so that your participants leave in a happy and satisfied mood. So we'll talk about how to prepare people for what's going to happen afterwards, after this, either this topic or this lesson or this course. And by the time you're done, you should be able to conclude a lesson using the OFF formula and the rest of the criteria from the TPMA distinction criteria. But let's start by looking at a demonstration. And this comes from the conclusion to the webinar that you saw in the other two video excerpts. And this is actually the conclusion of the webinar. It's not the conclusion of a topic. So it's a tiny bit longer. And so we've abridged it a little bit. So you'll see where we've edited it a little bit. As you go through this and watch it, I'd like you to write in the chat when you see what it is that the trainer has done. Go ahead. What are the things that the trainer does to do this conclusion? So, Rohit, will you roll the tape, please? So I hope these tips have helped you to feel a little more capable and competent about presenting online. So let's go back and see if we covered everything that we talked about. And rather than me reading this, right now, I would like you to write into the chat one tip that you learned today that you're going to apply the next time you do a webinar. So go ahead and write something in the chat. Standing while presenting. Thank you, Rajiva. It definitely helps. If you want to know more about this, we actually have a self-study course that is coming out in a week or two called From Live in the Classroom to Live Online. And this looks a lot more at how do you convert your classroom for the webinar environment. There's also another class coming out to help you think about, do you even need a webinar or could you use something else? And we have a longer program on instructional design. So make sure that you keep coming back to the Grow, Learn, Connect page to learn more. So at this point, I'm going to open it up to questions. You can write your questions in the chat. And Rania, were there any questions that came up that you would like me to start answering while we wait?
Yes, Karen. There is one good question from Muhammad Hayrar. And he's saying that he has been practicing IFC methodology, all with the delivering the training with gloss, ease off, and the feed formula, and incorporating some local folk wisdom in it. And he would like to have some suggestions for rationalizing and localizing the delivery methods so that training should be more interactive.
So how do you use that? Well, it's the same way. So gloss, get attention. Remember I talked about asking a question or using a trivia question or a statistic to get people's attention. Link it, just like you've heard me do throughout this. Make sure you know your transitions from one slide to the next and from one topic. Give the objectives up front, just like we said, here's what we're going to cover. And state the structure. We told you what we were going to cover in what order, and stimulate interest. Again, try to relate it to the people. So everything you've done for gloss, you can do here. For off, same thing. Repeat the main points. Ask for feedback. Just like I said, what is one thing you're going to learn? And we're going to also have an evaluation at the end. And think about the future. And we talked about the future in terms of your training and going to the Grow, Learn, Connect network, and also about how you're going to use it. And in terms of gloss ease, given an example, the activities are usually a little simpler. If you're doing a longer webinar or a multi-webinar session, you can get into some more practice type of activities. And give examples. Examples are always good. So I think all of these still really apply. I hope that answers the question. Rania, I'm going to turn it over to you for final words.
Thanks, Karen. So I would like to thank everyone for your participation. It was really excellent. And I would like to encourage you to take the survey, which I just posted in the chat, so that we get your feedback on the session. As was mentioned before, this is the first session of a number of others over the upcoming months. So it's very important for us to get your feedback and comments so that we always work on improving our services. So thank you, everyone, and please have a very good day or evening or afternoon, wherever you are.
Karen, you're on mute.
Thank you. Let me try that again. All right, so good job. Thank you, everybody, for your feedback. I saw you were writing as you watched this. You hit all of the things that I did. I reviewed the outcomes. I talked about next steps. I gave resources. I talked about what you could do for the future. I focused on the future. And I fortified with feedback. I asked them what questions they had, and I gave explanations. And I asked them to complete the evaluation form. Right, so you hit all of these things. Good job. You noticed all the major components. So because this was the end of the session, the conclusion took a little bit more time. Had this been the end of a lesson, it would have been a lot shorter. I might not have gone into so many resources or asked them about the evaluation form. But the point is that even with this, it didn't take that long to do, but it makes a big difference in giving participants a complete experience. So how similar is this to what you do, and how similar is it to what TPMA requires? Well, let's take a very quick look here. So again, you have the TPMA indicators for off in your handout, and here they are. So just take a quick look through here, and if there are any that you either never do or don't do well, go ahead and use the annotation button to mark it with a 1 if you never do it, or a 2 if you only occasionally do it or don't do it so well. So go ahead and use that use that annotation feature. And as you're doing that, I see there's a question from Ahmed about, can you explain feedback a little bit more? So feedback really has 2 components to it. Feedback is you getting feedback from them about whether they understood. So when you do like the learning objectives, instead of just telling them, look for ways that you can get them to tell you what they learned. And that will give you some feedback too about how much they really got it. And then the other thing is feedback, how am I doing? Is it okay? Is the speed too fast? Is it not? Filling out the evaluation form. You can do any type of feedback to help you too. So that's what we talk about. And I should mention that you can do off in any order. It's not really critical that you do it in that order, although it's recommended, but you can switch it around. And I see as I look at the results, do we have to use, there was a question from Austin, do we have to use off at the end of the course or every session? I would do it at the end of every session, right? And I would also do it at the end of every lesson, just like you see here that we do. Every time we get to a lesson, I say, okay, let me go back and review those objectives and let's talk about what we're going to talk next. If you're doing an off for a lesson or a session or something in the middle, the focus on the future can be as simple as saying, now that you know this, next we're going to look at how you apply it here, and just give them like that transition. So that focus on the future can be that link to the next topic. So I see arrange an action plan. Yeah, that one doesn't get done as much as it probably should. I see a lot of 2s and 1s there. And that's really important because if you go back to that concept, again, about ask CC, remember attitude, skills, knowledge, confidence, and commitment. It's during the off in particular that you build up that commitment to do it by telling them, asking them, put together an action plan, or what are the next 2 things you're going to do? Or as I did here, what's one thing you're going to apply? Any of that kind of helps transition them from here in the classroom to here's my promise, mainly to myself, of what I'm going to do next. Well, the video showed a very simple and quick way of reviewing by summarizing the discussion. But you can use more engaging ways to make the points stick even more in participants' minds. Oh, and Rohit, can you clear that? Thanks. So there's a theory called the recency effect, and it says that people remember most what they hear last. So reviewing the main points cements the ideas in people's minds. And there's another training saying that people remember most what they hear themselves say. So if you want people to remember something or to believe it, try to get them to say. So depending on how much time you have at the end of a lesson or a course, you have different options for how to review. And as the table on the slide shows, the faster you review, the less people remember. Similarly, the more interactive the review, the more people remember. Now, the quickest, easiest, most common, and frankly, least effective way is to simply reread or restate the main points or the learning objectives for the audience. And while this does not help the participants remember all that much, it still has some positive effects. For instance, it makes the last thing they hear the most important point that you want them to remember. And it reminds them of what they were supposed to have learned so that they leave feeling satisfied. So in this lesson, you learned how to, do off. Oh yeah, that's what I said I was going to learn how to do. Yeah, okay, that's good. And it just brings the session full circle so that it feels complete. A slightly more effective version of the quick review is to read the learning objectives and ask participants to give an example of that or to recall the most important points. So that's what I did just before when I said, okay, we're finishing up the feed formula. Write in the chat, what does feed stand for, right? I forced you to recall it. Recalling is a better way to get people to remember. Review games. Often you can use this using famous TV shows or board games or parlor games. You use the same rules as well-known games, but all the content comes from whatever you taught in the class. And then the last one I want to talk about is a learning tournament. This is an amazing tool, but it takes at least 40 minutes to do it well. So the idea is you divide the class into 2 or 3 groups, and you give the class 15 minutes to work in their groups to create 3 questions and the related answers that they're going to use to quiz the other teams. And the content, the questions and the answers, must come from anything that was included in the participant guides. So then you give them the time to work on this, they come back together. Team 1 asks Team 2 the first question. If Team 2 gets it right, Team 2 gets a point. If Team 2 gets it wrong, Team 3 gets a chance. So Team 3 guesses, they get it right, they get the point. Then Team 3 asks the question, Team 3 asks the question, Team 1 gets it wrong, Team 2 gets it wrong. In that case, Team 3 gets another point. So now what happens is the audience is, or the participants in their teams, they're looking for the hardest questions they can come up with. And so they dig really deep into the material and they pull out all this really great information, but it forces them to really look at the material, really think about it. And so they remember and they learn so much more than if you just say, here are the objectives. I haven't tried to do that yet, frankly, on an online course, but in the classroom, this works fantastically. Well, speaking of conclusions, that brings us to the end of this lesson. And we have just a few minutes left. So before I come back to the questions, I want to I'm going to switch the order here. I am going to just review this very quickly. We talked about the 3 components of OFF, right? And those components are outline the objectives, right? Go back over it, focus on the get feedback and fortify with feedback, and focus on the future. Do the link either to the next topic, to the next session, or to what they can do to apply this in the future. And so with that, I want to, actually, I'm going to go back and do the questions now. So what questions do you have on anything that we've covered in this lesson? Go ahead and you can speak it if it's quicker, or you can write it in chat, whichever you prefer. Kazi, I think you're. Okay, well, not hearing any questions. Here's one. OFF doesn't need to be in sequence, is that correct? Yes, that's correct. You can do it in any order. What I find most of the time in webinars, I prefer that the questions be the very last slide, because what I find in webinars, not so much in live online learning, is as soon as you get to the question slide, half the people leave. So if you want to reinforce the learning, do the review of the objectives first so that they hear those main points, and then do the question. So if people leave, they're not missing anything. In only OFF part, we can get feedback from participants. No, so the question is that the only time that we can get feedback from the participants? And the answer is no. And if you're doing activities and you're debriefing and you're letting everybody talk, you'll be getting feedback anyway, because, you know, if you're teaching them math, just to keep this simple, and you say, what is 2 times 3? And everybody writes 5, that's feedback that they don't understand the difference between multiplication and addition. And also you can encourage people along the way to give you feedback. If there's an issue, you know, just let me know. And if you're doing a multi-session course, I always like to end the day, especially if it's in person, by doing what we call a pulse check. So some type of quick activity where you say, as we leave today, please write on sticky paper or something, you know, one word that describes, you know, what you're feeling, or one question that you have, or one thing that you're still confused about, and you put it up. So there's a lot of ways to do it through that. So, yes.
I don't know about others, but I feel still a little uneasy to take feedback face to face. How to overcome that? Because I always feel if they give some negative feedback, then the program will fall. But I want to end on a positive. So if you have any feedback, give me written feedback so I can see it later, but not face to face. That's a limitation, I still think. Yeah, go ahead.
That's legitimate. And Cassie, I feel that way too a lot of the times. And so a little bit it's reading your audience too, that you know, if everybody's really happy, then it's easy to do that positive feedback out loud. But that's why I like using like sticky papers, or you can do chats or something like that, where, you know, they can write it down for you. And so you still have it, but you don't have to, you know, like in the moment, just, you know, like you can stop yourself from doing that reaction of, the other thing too, to keep in mind is what I call the Shark Tank approach to receiving feedback, which is, I don't know if you know the show, the Shark Tank,
yes,
but
just heard about it. The entrepreneurship, the investment interviews and all that. Okay, go ahead.
That's correct. And what they do, people give feedback. The rule is you're not allowed to discuss. All you can do is say, thank you, thank you. You can ask a question to clarify, but you can't ask a question that's really explaining yourself. And I find, you know, that works really well. It works surprisingly well. So when people give you feedback, you just say, thank you. And they're happy and you're happy and nobody is upset, and you just move on. It's amazing. It's a really cool technique. So guess what, folks? We have reached an important triple milestone in this course. We are now at the end of this lesson, and we're at the end of module 3. And we are now 2/3 through the whole program. Woohoo! So our homework assignment for tonight reflects these milestones. So your homework is complete the interim evaluation form that Serena is going to send you, and relax, have a night off, no homework tonight, woohoo! And we will start tomorrow with the topic that's also really near and dear to all of us, that is, we should talk about how to manage the classroom and the people in it and the time. So that is tomorrow. And I see a comment from Shoma here. I have one on feed. How should we follow feed while giving positive feedback? What would be the recommendation? Okay, that's a great question. Before I let you go, I'm going to answer that. You do it the same way. You just, when you examine the evidence, you just pick on something positive. So I like the way I like the way you answered everybody's questions. I noticed that you you read people's names as you said their question. That had the effect of making them feel very validated. I suggest you keep doing that, or keep it up, or good job, keep doing that.
Karen, the fact that there is no homework today, is this a bit like the sandwich approach where the homework tomorrow is going to be particularly exciting?